want to start a new tape. But before I do anything else, I want to correct an error which I noticed at the beginning of the last tape. I said there that this was July 16th. Well, it was July 20th, which was the anniversary of the man on the moon. So I just want to correct that particular item. Now to go back to where we ended off on the last tape, we were talking about North 3rd Street, Bruder's Black from the old roller rink, or today the bowling alley. Now, we'll speak more about the blacksmith shops afterwards. Next door to that was, you remember when you were a kid, it was vacant then, was the Old Fish Brewery. I remember when the brewery closed in 1920 as a result of the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution. We talked about that earlier. Now, next to the Fish Brewery, the Fish Brewery, I might say, has been remodeled. There are apartment houses in there, apartment complexes, and also business offices. Now, next to the Fish Brewery was the Frederick Lumber Company over there. That big 3-story brick building that operates, and in its place is a modern calcite credit union building, very imposing. The rest of the Frederick Company complex is now also offices, general offices. Now, just beyond that, going north, you remember as the depot, the D&M depot, where the railroad tracks came in along 2nd Street. Today, that depot is gone, and that's where we have the Bowie Restaurant and the Driftwood Motel. The train came that far. The engine and its tender went up a little bit, turned around, came back, hooked on to the passenger and freight cars that were there, and then back out of town. Now, for a minute, let's get back downtown to the bank corner where the big high dome bank is that Dad worked in. Now, we said that right across from that in the early days was a saloon, Fisher's Saloon, and then you remembered as a Wada 5 and dime store. Going toward the lake at that spot, at the end of the block, was the city or village hall and fire station. Then across 2nd Street was the Rice Building. That's one of the older established homes in town. Next to that was the Hasenberg Hilla Grocery. And then the Star Theater. Now, the Star Theater, you'll recall, was managed by Mr. Walter Kelly. Now, Walter was himself a farrier. He was a blacksmith by trade, and had run the Kelly blacksmith shop down along 1st Street, along with his brother. Now, the old Star Theater, when I first knew it, was a silent movie house. That is, you went in, the pictures appeared on a big screen, and the printed word appeared below it, describing the action or saying what the actors and actresses said as it went along. Now, you had to be able to read. And quite often in there, you would hear people very silently reading. They were probably reading to somebody who couldn't read. Now, that happened in the early days. And they read very quietly, because there were some people who just didn't have that ability. Now, some people could read Polish, some people could read German, but they couldn't read English. And so, in order to enjoy the movie at all, they had to have somebody interpret for them. Now, there are a variety of reasons, of course, why some people couldn't read. Some had never had the opportunity. Some of them had come from the old country and never attended school. They were already adults. And others, possibly, we would call it today dyslexia. They just could not read the printed word. I knew of several people in that category. They could understand the spoken word. They could hold a good conversation with you, but they simply could not read. They understood basic mathematics. They understood money. They understood coins. They knew enough so they could tell a $1 or $2, $5 or $10 or $20 bill. They could sign their name. but they could not read a simple letter or write a simple letter. They had to rely on others to do that for them. Now a word about the blacksmith shops. There were probably 3, 4, or 5 blacksmith shops as I read it in the early history in Roger City. And they naturally had to have these people around. The trade was called a farrier, who made shoes for horses, and was a general metal worker. Now there were just hundreds and hundreds of horses that had to be associated with a town or with any area that was timbering, was cutting down trees and bringing them into the mills. And that's before, of course, the days we had the trucks and buses and caterpillars. Now, in case of Roger City, that lumber, or those timbers that came in from the surrounding townships, of course, had to be hauled in by wagon and sleigh. Sleigh, most of it in the wintertime, because it was easier to come by sleigh than it was to come by wagon and wheel. And so you had to have a lot of horses. The timber was brought into the mills here along the lake in Roger City, and there it was processed into lumber. Roger City didn't have a big river to float the logs into the mills like they had in Alpena or Sheboygan, or Petoskey or Charlevoix or Boyne City or East Jordan, or Alpena with the Thunder Bay River, or the Osable River down at Osable and Oscoda. Further on, the Augrey River, the Rifle River, and on the other side, of course, there was Traverse City, and there was Frankfort, the Manistee, Ludington, all located at the mouths of big rivers where these logs could be stored in lakes or ponds until they were processed. We didn't have that here. The stuff had to be brought in, so we had a little bit more horsepower here than they did most places. So that's part of the business. Now, these farriers also, of course, did repair a lot of other metal. Now, of course, the mills themselves had a lot of metal in them, the processing mills. And metal broke. It had to be repaired. And then, of course, there was the agricultural equipment that had to be repaired, the plows, the harrows, the binders, and the cultivators, and the wagon wheels, and the sleighs had to be repaired. So the farriers were a very, very important part of the early economic life of the community. Now, another subject I'd like to talk about just briefly and my remembrances of it, and that is in the area of the religion and the churches. Now, the 3 large religious denominations that I recall from my early days was the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, and the Presbyterian Church. Now, the Catholic Church, as near as I can find out from reading the history of Roger City, the first church was built along about 1876, down on the corner of 2nd and Erie. It would be right where across from the IGA grocery store is now, or the county library. I remember that building, remember it well. And then later on, the church and school was built at the end of 3rd Street, where it is today. That was built about 1920. And at that time, in 1920, they started the Catholic school. Now, the Lutheran, the first Catholic church, as I recall, was about 1876. The first Lutheran church, as near as I can get from the history, was about 1872, along on 1st Street there someplace. And the Catholic school, or the Lutheran school, was started about 1916. And now the church building, the Lutheran church building, where all the kids in the family and Mother and Dad went to, that church building, that wooden church building, on the corner of 5th and Erie, was built by 1907. That is no longer there. That building was torn down some years ago. Now the church is on top of what was now Hef's Hill, where the whole old Heft house was. That is the site of the modern Lutheran church built in 1970. Now, the Presbyterian church, or the stone church on the corner at the end of our block, was built about 1923-24. Now that church is a combination of various Protestant denominations that were in the community in the early days. There was a small Methodist congregation. There was a small group of Congregationalists, a small group of Church of Christ, and a small group of Presbyterians. And so they finally decided that they couldn't survive individually. It just didn't work. They just didn't have enough money. So through good insight and through some willing people on the part of these various combinations, they combined about 1922-23 and formed the Presbyterian Church. And then they went out with the object of building a new church for the whole group. And that's what they did. At the end of our block, on 2 or 3 lots that were owned by Mr. and Mrs. C.H. Osgood, the Osgoods donated the lots. That was a big pine grove of trees there on that corner. You recall the Osgood house, it's still there today, and it serves as the manse for the Presbyterian Church. But that's how that got started. Now, subsequent to that, I don't want to slight any other organizations at all. At the present time, we not only have the 3 what we would call the bigger units, but we also have a Jehovah's Witness church here in the community. We have a Christian Bible church. We have a Southern Baptist group. And we also have an Episcopal church. So you can say that Rogers City at the present time is well churched. Now let's get on to another subject here that I'd like to talk about briefly, and that is about the schools of Rogers City, the old hometown. Now the school district, Rogers Union School District, was started in 1871, at the same year that the village of Rogers City was started by acts of the legislature. The legislature at that time directed the circuit court to supervise the start of the school system, to raise money to put up a building, to raise money to equip it, and to raise money to hire a teacher so that the children in that area would get proper education. Now, the first school, as I recall it from reading the history of Rogers City, was built about 1872. It was a 2-room structure, probably built on the back end of what is now the post office building. And that served for a period of time, and then in 1903, the old yellow building, wooden building that you and I attended, was purchased by the district. Mr. P.H. Heff built that building with the intention of building it as a Lutheran school. But they got into some kind of a wrangle, and so he sold the building to the public school system that needed room. There were 2 rooms up, 2 rooms down, big rooms, with a great big bell steeple on that belfry, on that building. And that's where I started in 1917. Then in 1918, because the community was growing, the plant was expanding, they needed more room. So they put on a 4-room addition on that wooden building with inside toilets downstairs. Before that, when I first went there, the toilets were outside. Then in 1912 and 13, they built the old red brick high school that you and I attended. Across the street, 2.5 stories, 12 rooms. And the high school was on the 2nd floor, with some of it on the basement. And on the other parts of the 1st floor were the grades 5 and 6. And that served for many, many years. Then in 1927-28, the high school that you and I graduated from was built. There were a couple homes on that lot, but they were moved off, and a new structure was put on that site. Our dad, George W. Grambua, was on the board at that time as secretary. We moved in there in April of 1928. Herm was a senior, and he just spent a couple months in that building, and that was the first class to graduate there, the class of 28. I spent a couple of years there. My junior and senior year were spent there in that building, and of course all of yours. Subsequent George, Grace, Ernestine, Treese. Now, the buildings that were built subsequent to that time on top of the hill, Hef's Hill, the elementary building up there and the new elementary building in the high school, were built during my administration. As you recall, that was swamp up there, Hef's Rabbit Swamp. We actually did go up there to hunt rabbits. And so it's interesting. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about my school days, especially high school days. People have asked me, well, now, just what was your curriculum like when you were in high school as compared to what it is today at the time that we moved into that new high school in 2728? Well, that year that we moved in 2728, the high school, which we just moved over, was primarily an academic institution. When I started high school, we had 4 years of English, years of history. We had ancient history, we had modern history, U.S. history, civics, and economics. We had 3.5 years of math, algebra, advanced algebra, geometry, solid geometry, trigonometry. Now, in the Commerce Department, that's the only thing that we had in the vocational area. We had a couple years of shorthand, a couple years of bookkeeping, and typing. The only extracurricular activity that we had, you might say, was, as far as high school was concerned, was vocal music. Now, that's the thing that we brought over from the other building. Now, the faculty that we had at that time when we moved in 2728, there were only nine people on that high school faculty. There was H.H. Gilpin, who taught some of the economics and civics. There was Mr. Milton Young. He was a principal, and he taught the science, and general science, chemistry, and physics. His wife, Lucille, taught the English. Bertha Klein was the Latin teacher and history teacher and English teacher. Gertrude Fiegel taught the government, taught the history, ancient history, modern history, U.S. history. There was a Beatrice Comlecoy who taught the commerce, shorthand, typing, bookkeeping. There was a Dorothy Baker that taught a little English, a little history. And Josie Schutz Valentine, who taught the vocal music. Now, the general substitute for practically everything in high school was Genevieve Raines. She'd been around for, of course, quite some time. And she substituted for even the years that when I was high school, principal and superintendent. She was still there substituting. Now, it isn't generally known that when Genevieve Raines came here, Genevieve Raines, she was Genevieve McLouth. She married Ty Raines after she got here. And during World War I, Genevieve actually in 1718 was the high school principal. She had her degree and qualified for that job. The men were all off to war, and so Genevieve was the principal for the 1 year. Now, after we moved into that building, starting in the fall of 28, of course, then the curriculum started to expand. We added physical education for both boys and girls. We added the shop department, wood shop, mechanical drawing. We added the biology department. We added full typing classes. I took a half-year typing in the old building, which was a part of a corridor. There were 5 or 6 typewriters there, and it was just catch-can typing. The teacher came in at the beginning of the period, or at the beginning of the semester, and taught you how to sit at the typewriter, where to put your hands. There was a diagram on the wall, and you just practiced by yourself. Very seldom did she come in. And if she did come in, it was usually to give a speed test to the kids who had the speed. I didn't have any. I just kind of learned what the typewriter was all about. But anyway, we got into a full typing class where we had 20 typewriters when we went into high school. In the fall of 28, we developed a library. Before that, we just had a room they called the library. Consisted of a couple hundred books on the shelf, and that was all. But we had a librarian, and they started to fill up the library. We started football in the fall of 28 with a coach by the name of Hurdle Feeman. And we introduced classes such as speech and dramatics. So we started to develop into a full program, which of course is ever expanding as time goes on. Now, in the fall of 1930, when I graduated, I went to Michigan State. I got my bachelor's degree there in 1934. I might say that just a couple of months ago, I went back to Michigan State and attended the 60th class reunion of my class of graduating from Michigan State, the class of 34. They held a observance in Kellogg Center, which is one of the great meeting halls at Michigan State College. Well, anyway, I graduated in the spring of 34, and then I went on to the University of Michigan and got my master's degree there in 1939. Now, in the fall I didn't have a job when I graduated, of course. This was the Great Depression. And it just so happened, through luck, that an opening came in Rogers City in the fall of 35 in the history department, which I could qualify for. So I took the job, never thinking that how long it was going to last. I started teaching the 7th and 8th grade civics and economics, or civics and history, and I taught 10th grade world history, and I was a study hall teacher and had charge of that infamous institution known as the Ninth Hour, which some of you remember. Now, this part is interesting. The first class that I walked into, starting my teaching career in Rogers City, 8:05 in the morning, September 8th, 1935. In a science lecture room, who did I meet? But Ernestine and Treese were in that class. 8th grade U.S. history. A couple other characters were in there. Bill Newhouse, with that cackling voice of his. There was Fred Dagner was in there, who graduated with Ernestine Treese. A couple of the girls that I remember just off the top of my head, one was Mildred Fleming, the other was Eunice Lamb. I had my sister Grace in the 10th grade in world history, and I didn't have George in class because Gilpin was teaching the economics and civics, but I did have him in study hall. Now, I stayed on to teach in general area of the high school and junior and senior high for 9 years. John D. Sibley was the principal. And in 1944, John Sibley left to take the principalship at Eaton Rapids, and the board asked me whether I wanted to try the principalship, and I did. So I stayed at that principalship for a period of 6 years, and then around the 1st of December 1950, Mr. H. Gilpin, who was the superintendent, died. And again, the board asked me whether I would like to take a shot at the superintendency, and I said I would. And that lasted 23 years, from 1950 to 1973. A total period in the school system of 38 years as a teacher and administrator. You count the 13 years in elementary school, high school that I had, and I have a total of 51 years in the system. Now, at the same time that I retired in 1973, Marion, who was on the faculty, retired. She had a total of approximately 26 years in. There were some years when she only taught part-time or half-time. Now, just to say a few words about Marion while I'm here, while I got it. Marion was born May 16th, 1911 in London. She was the daughter of John and Phoebe Ross. Now, her dad, John, was a railroad man. He worked primarily for the Pure Marquette Railroad. And he met Marion's mother in Manistee, where he had been assigned to the depot as general agent and telegrapher. And Marion's parents, the name of Lamson, were the owners and operators of a hotel, rooming and boarding house known as the Northland Hotel, which was used a lot by the railroad people. And that's where John stayed, and that's where John met Phoebe. Phoebe was working for her parents, working in the kitchen, working in general housekeeping in the hotel. And that's where they met. He was, at that time, out of Bad Axe. His parents lived in Bad Axe. And so they were married in 1901 in Manistee. And they had, while they lived in Manistee, they had one son, Don, Marion's older brother. He was born in 1904. Now, shortly after that, John was transferred to Ludington, where he became the general agent of the Pierre Marquette Railway and ferry system. The ferries that operated out of Ludington were under his direction. They carried the railroad cars and freight and people across Lake Michigan to Manitowoc and Milwaukee. Now, while they were there, of course, that's where they built their home. They built a nice, beautiful home on one of the streets there in Ludington. And it's interesting to note that the Tiffany lamp, which is hanging right here in this kitchen as I sit here, was the same lamp that John Ross bought someplace in Saginaw and brought home to put into their new home in Ludington. Beautiful Tiffany. Now, it just so happened that when Marion was quite young, probably about 1922, I guess it was, that her dad died, a stroke. And there was a period of kind of a reorganization there, you might say, in the family. For a period of a year, Marion, their mother, and Don moved to Lake City to stay with an uncle and an aunt there. The uncle was a doctor, and he figured it would be best if Marion's mother got herself organized a little bit. So they just left the home in Ludington, let it stay, and they just moved up bag and baggage for a period of a year to Lake City. Marion went to school there, her brother Don went to school there. And then they moved back. Marion's mother had decided that she would do the thing that she could do best, and that was run a rooming and boarding house. And that house that they had in Ludington was big. They made 4 large bedrooms on the second floor, which were later converted to apartment. And she roomed and boarded lady teachers primarily, but other people went there to eat. She knew quantity cookery and was used, of course, housekeeping because of the hotel. And so that's how she made her living. Now, Don, her brother, went on to Western Michigan College and then graduated from the University of Michigan. And then after graduation, he took a job at St. Clair, Michigan. Marion, after she graduated from high school in Ludington in 1929, went on to IPSI, or what we call Eastern Michigan University now. And in 1933, she got her bachelor's degree and her life certificate. In 1934, all of 1934, she started teaching she was out of a job for a while too, depression. She started teaching in Marlette, Michigan, teaching English, anywhere from 7th through 12th grade, dramatics and speech. And she taught there for a period of 6 years. Then in the fall of 1939, she had an opportunity to come to Rogers City. She wanted to see something a little bit different. And so she came to Rogers City. And now, I was on the faculty here in Rogers City. Now, while we were friendly, I wasn't particularly interested in I suppose getting married or anything else. I was just interested in having a good time. I still had debts to pay, and I wasn't interested. But I was enjoying life. I was spent practically every weekend hunting in the fall of the year for rabbits and partridge and deer, steelhead fishing on the Akia, or trout fishing for speckled trout in the spring of the year on Silver Creek and Trout River. Duck hunting in the fall. I loved duck hunting and did a lot of it, almost every weekend out to Lost Lake where Mother and Dad had property. And Marion, there were at the faculty at that time probably 7 or 8 young girls, all unmarried, and they were having a good time. Marion had a car, and she would quite often go back to Ludington or go to Marlette to see old friends. She also had some friends in Traverse City and Charlevoix that she went to visit. And then also in town, when she came here, she roomed and boarded, or roomed at a place, Mr. and Mrs. Otto Zempel, young people in town, very, very social people. And they took her right in with her, introduced her to the people that they knew, other young fellows in town that they knew. She got to know a lot of people in Roger City that I didn't know. So things went along, and I didn't really ask her for a date, I think, until probably the following year, around about the 1st of February. Now, this was 41. And so things went very, very good on that first date. Oh, that was fine. So along about the second date, I remember, was February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1941. And I proposed. And on Washington's birthday on February 22, I gave her a ring. So it was bing, bang, bong, jackpot. Wonderful 3 weeks. Now, we weren't married a whole year to go. We weren't married until the 1st of August, 1942, in Ludington. Ernestine was Marion's bridesmaid, and Don Ross, her brother, was my best man. And Mother and Dad were at the affair. Herman Esther were at the affair. And we started our honeymoon one-day affair. We went up to Traverse City after a reception at the church house. And started back to Roger City. When we got to Traverse City, that was our first destination. We had planned that we would stay at the Park Place Hotel, which was a just very new place, very nice hotel in Traverse City. I remember we took our suitcases and walked in to register and found out the place was full. Jammed full, not a room available. Wow, a big convention was in town, and of course didn't know anything about it, and hadn't made previous reservations, which was probably a little foolish, but nevertheless that's the way it happened. So I said to the clerk at the desk, is there any chance that you could call some other place and see if we could get a room? And he said, I doubt it, because other places have been calling us. And he did say, however, that he had one room if we were at all interested. Well, I said, what's that? He said, it's the penthouse. But he said, the cost is $45. And I said, man, I haven't got $25 to spend for a room. I said, we're on our honeymoon. I said, I want to have enough money to buy some gas to get back to Roger City. And he said, you on your honeymoon? I said, yes. He's just a young fellow at the desk. He said, just a minute. So he left the desk there, went to the back of the desk where there was an office area, and I could hear him talking to somebody in there. And he came out, and he had a kind of smile on his face. And he said, for a honeymooners, he said the cost of the penthouse is $10. I said, sold. Boy, what a surprise that was. So he called the bellhop over, and he said, take these people up to the top room. He said they were going to occupy the penthouse. So away we went. Man, that was some room, I'm telling you. I walked into that room, there was 2 great big bedrooms, a big living room, big radio, lamps, end tables, and a big bathroom, big kitchen. The kitchen was actually equipped with a refrigerator and stove. And a great big patio on the outside where you could go out and you could look over the whole town of Traverse City. It was a warm evening, beautiful sight. And so I said to the bellhop, I said, he said, what are the chances of getting about 4 bottles of beer set up? And he said, they're good. He said, I'll get them for you. So he left, and we started to come pack a little bit there, and in a little bit, didn't take too long, we rapped at the door, and in comes the bellhop. He had a great big tray, he had 4 bottles of beer and a couple of glasses, and he had a little dish, which consisted of small packages of wrapped crackers and small packages of wrapped cheese, and a little vase of flowers. So I offered to pay for them. He said, no. He says, compliments to the house. The flowers, he took the flowers and put them on a little table in the dining room. Wow. So that was a big, big surprise. Big, big surprise. The next morning, we went down, go to check out. We went into the breakfast room, to the dining room for breakfast. And I'll be darned, even the breakfast was on the house. Isn't that something? So when I went to the checkout at the desk, I said, is there anybody around that was here from last night? The fellow said, no. I said, we've been treated so wonderful. I said, I'd certainly like to thank somebody. I said, do you have to have a piece of stationery here or something? I could write a note. And so they got it. And we wrote a nice note and told them about the wonderful treatment and that we would be back. And we did go back in future years. I never did encounter the same guy that was at the desk. But nevertheless, it was a wonderful experience. So we got back to Rogers City and spent the next whole 50 years on a honeymoon. Marion passed away on January 27th, 1993. Now, you might just ask there, well, how come the long delay between the time that you got engaged and between the actual wedding? Well, it's very simple. Marion had a car that was only half paid for. I had a car that was only half paid for. And I still owed several $100s on money that I'd borrowed to get my master's degree, and I was paying that off very gradually. Well, we thought it was foolish to start in debt, so we said, well, we'll just postpone the wedding, and meantime, after we get those things paid for, we will accumulate a little furniture wherever we're going to live. We didn't know, but that's what we did. Now, you got to remember, this was wartime. There were a lot of places in Rogers City for rent. I imagine that we probably, after we got engaged, we looked around probably at a dozen places. You see, people could get out. They could go to work in the war plants that had started in Detroit, Flint, Pontiac. Any place you wanted, you could find a job. So some people just closed their homes and went down and worked in the war plants. Well, so we just decided to buy furniture. So we bought a bedroom outfit, complete, over a period of time. And we bought a living room outfit, a sofa, some lounge chairs. We bought a radio record player combination, a couple end tables, bridge lamps, desk lamps, coffee table. And we bought a kitchen table and 4 chairs, which we later sold to Teresa and John. We bought a refrigerator, and we bought a gas stove for the kitchen. And we bought a lot of kitchen utensils of various types and descriptions that you needed when you got started. It's interesting to note about the gas stove. The war was on, and I remember it was Fred McCutcheon. We bought a Pyrofax stove, gas. And he said, well, I can sell you the stove, but he said, under the regulations now, he said, you can't sell a stove unless you can hook it up immediately, because they didn't want any profiteering going on. Somebody could come along and buy 10 or 12 stoves, and then hold them and sell them at a big profit later on. So whatever stove that you bought, he had to hook up the gas. And I said, all right. We put the stove in Mother and Dad's basement, across from the furnace. Hooked on a gas tank on the outside, and we had a gas stove in the basement. But we stored some of the stuff in Mother and Dad's basement. We stored some of it in the big room upstairs where I slept upstairs. Some of it we stored out in the garage. But by the time that we got a house, what happened was that we finally, along probably maybe about April or May of that year, decided to rent a house which was just being built, completed, up in Pinewood area. The house belonged to Ernie and Edna Vigeland. Now, Edna had been a classmate of mine in high schools, and she and her husband had built several homes that they built just for investment purposes. This one happened to be located right alongside of her parents, Dick and Hattie Land, people that I knew. And that's where we started to move that stuff in a couple of months before we were married. And it worked out very, very well. And so that's what happened. By the time that we got close to the wedding, I know Marion's mother came over, and they kind of helped set up that house, get everything in order, so that when we did move in, after the wedding, that we'd have things pretty well in order. Well, we even had a garden out and back. Started the garden along about last of April, 1st of May. And by that August when we got married, we had a beautiful garden. We had tomatoes, we had cucumbers, we had carrots and beets and green beans and yellow beans. And we had green pepper, we had red pepper. And we even had rhubarb plants. Somebody at the back end of that lot had planted rhubarb plants years ago. And so we did all right. And so that's the way it happened. Well, that's enough for today.